Hello everyone, and welcome to the 20th ripoff episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the targets from the original Assassin's Creed. The first Assassin's Creed is a very interesting game. It was made early on in the 7th generation of consoles, and was a very ambitious idea, but the execution was somewhat stilted, which would be improved in future games, but Assassin's Creed 1, despite being Assassin's Creed in its purest form, is still rough around the edges. But, as a setting-based story, the journey of Altair's quest for redemption caused him to learn the tenets of the Assassin's Creed, and those who oppose that, the Templars, who believe in control rather than letting humanity have their own free will. Now before we begin, I will base the order Altair killed his targets based on the novel The Secret Crusade, which is the complete story of Altair, and the book lays out what the canonical kill order was. I am not above external material in regards to these characters, so any external information will be included if any exist. Also, given she was not killed and eventually redeemed herself, Maria will not be included in this analysis. So without further ado, let's begin. As those who have played the game will know, Tamir is the first character to be slain by Altair. Characterized as a black market dealer, who rose from the bottom to become one of the biggest death merchants across the Holy Land. As I just mentioned, he had rather small beginnings, as he was once a mere caravan merchant according to Assassin's Creed lore. A common theme of the game is once feeling death's embrace, the target will give out their motivations for serving the Templar cause. Tamir openly questions why Altair has done this, as he openly thinks it's unfair to take his life, when there are so many others who sell weapons to the highest bidder, and that he serves a far nobler cause than that. I would argue that, however, that Tamir, like many we're about to talk about, was an extremist in the pursuit of peace. He is clearly shown to have next to no empathy, as in his assassination mission, he slashes an employee for talking back to him. The employee very fairly laid out a complaint about being overworked, but Tamir just saw it as laziness, and mutilated him for disrespecting him, not holding back when mercy was asked of him. It becomes truly questionable if Tamir was being sincere about his motives as a Templar, as he clearly had no care towards his employees and enjoyed profiting from the war. I would make the case that Tamir was by definition a ruthless and selfish man, who allied with the Templars under a very narrow precedent of starting a new world order. It's unlikely the Templars interfered with his profits at all, and Tamir may have truly believed he was doing a higher good, but it was dragged down by all of his heinous actions. Like almost everyone I'll talk about in this video, he was in a powerful position, and sought to control to obtain peace, obviously with him in a high position. A common theme with the Templars is that they don't care about how they control their victims, only that they be controlled. It's oppression, and that's why the assassins oppose them, as they know that this is not the way to do things. Philosophy is the key factor of the Assassin-Templar War, and it has remained that way for thousands of years. Tamir, to summarize, was a cold, uncaring psychopath who was well off on his own, and I imagine his allegiance to the Templar Order was out of a means to feel like he was serving a higher good, rather than actually changing his ways. Robert de Sable, who we will get to, likely told him he was doing the right thing, and so he believed it without question. However, one who does not stop to question their own choices is bound to make the wrong ones in the end, and that's exactly what happened with Tamir. Garnier de Naplouse, loosely based on his historical counterpart, was the leader of the Knights Hospitalier in Acre. Now, since Garnier was also a Templar, that very much indicates that by the orders and by extension the manipulation of Robert de Sable, Garnier was elevated to the top position of the Knights Hospitalier, so his leadership is nothing more than a branch of the Templar Order. Still, as a high-ranking Templar, Garnier is said to have been exiled from his home country France for his detestable experiments. Garnier saw suffering as merely a way to advance medical research. He didn't care how he got the information. only that he got it. From a certain point of view, sometimes experiments have to be done to advance human knowledge, but where Garnier went wrong is that he used unwilling subjects to torture for the sake of research. It may have been slower to get volunteers with forewarning that they were going to be subject to pain to advance science, but that would have been a more ethical way to conduct experiments. Despite that being the obvious alternative, Garnier clearly did not adopt it, because suffering was something he relished in. It was pure sadism. As shown in Assassin's Creed, the Templars kidnapped people from Jerusalem and brought them to be experimented on. Garnier in his defense states that the people he kidnapped didn't even have homes, and that they were mentally ill. But I think this only indicates that he saw especially mentally ill people as lesser beings that were perfectly fine for him to experiment on, ignoring that the mentally ill still have consciousness, but Garnier likely didn't see it that way. And it's why he saw them as mere children. It can be inferred that while at first, it may seem like he has at least some care, however twisted towards his subjects, he was still at the end of the day abusive. Altair points out to Al-Mualim that some, not all, but enough of the patients seem to appreciate Garnier's experimenting despite the pain. But this is likely a farce since those who suffered under Garnier did not know any better. Like Tamir, Garnier likely spun his cruel methods into a positive for humanity, with the mentality that this does advance research at the end of the day, and never considered the downsides. He relied too much on the piece of Eden, which was stolen, and he had no alternative aside from cutting into and mutilating his patients, as his experiments resulted in numerous deaths. It didn't even have to be direct experimentation to be acceptable, as he ordered his men to break the legs of one of the patients trying to escape. He resorted to the most brutal method for stopping him from escaping, which tells me at the very least that he got so carried away with inflicting pain that he became senseless to basic decency in the world. He was wholly convinced that he was doing a natural good, but he really wasn't. Research is research, but that doesn't make you a hero if you acquired it through suffering. That's why Garnier was evil, and why his methods were misguided at best, and downright sadism at worst. Talal is the slaver in Jerusalem, who is collaborating with Garnier to kidnap people and sell them off against their will. Talal, like most other Templars, believes that he's doing a natural good. He states that the people he kidnapped were not fit enough to be effective slaves, and that he was actually trying to help them. He disliked when Altair called him a slaver, and like most of the other Templars, made his case that he was making the world a better place. Still, Talal reeks of the peace through control mentality that Templars are known for, because he clearly did not consider any alternatives. It was made clear that he did profit from the slave trade, and regardless of how much he fed and sheltered the slaves, that doesn't excuse it. The basic right to be free is non-negotiable, and if Talal really wanted to help his subjects, he would have allowed them to make their own choices. He could have built shelters, built a community. Instead, he sold people off to Garnier, who showed contempt for the slaves and subjected them to awful treatment. Talal did not think of himself as a slaver, but rather as a helper of the downtrodden. But it's clear that at best, he was doing the bare minimum for his slaves. Just because you cover a slave's basic essentials doesn't make it right, and as we see in the game, his slaves were locked up in cramped spaces and were clearly unhappy to say the least. Talal clearly thought he was doing a natural good, without considering whether his slaves enjoyed their treatment, which they absolutely did not. Talal pretty much decided what was best for them on his own terms, and never listened to anyone, minus his superior Robert the Sarb, who clearly didn't care what he did with his slaves. Talal may speak of helping the slaves, but many slave owners in general argued the same thing, with nothing to show for it. Freedom is not a privilege, it's a right, and Talal did not understand that. Like Tamir, he likely saw the profit he made from the business as the reason to continue, while convincing himself that he was a good man for what he was doing, when he wasn't. Abul is an interesting case for a one-off target in this game. As seen in his assassination mission, he ripped into everyone there for seeing him as an abomination, despite the fact that he gave out so much. But why? Why did people see him as an abomination? At first glance, it might be because he's ugly, but that's clearly not a convincing reason, especially since back then, obesity was a sign of power rather than weakness. If you were overweight, you were probably very wealthy. So what is it? Well, anyone who picks up on numerous details can come to one clear conclusion. Abul is homosexual. The way he caresses his guards, the way he states that he's been seen as, quote, different, it doesn't take Scooby-Doo to surmise that Abul is extremely frustrated at the world for not accepting his different nature. It's interesting to see a gay man who is not closeted in the 12th century in the Muslim world, because it can tell us a lot about him. Abul, from a certain perspective, can be seen as a victim of historical relativism, as most of everyone at the time thought of homosexuality as a sin, but this isn't an excuse to murder them. Abul in particular was incredibly wealthy and privileged, and his allies in the Templar Order clearly accepted him for who he was. So while the talk of his differences behind his back was not the right thing to do, responding with poisoning your guests is not the right thing to do either. Abul was someone born at the wrong place at the wrong time, and perhaps if he had been born today, he would not have gone on a destructive rampage. But he was clearly shaped by extreme religious homophobia of the time, and he resented that so much to where he resorted to violence. Still though, it's clear that he was well off despite his homosexuality, and he clearly believed that he did everything right for the people who despised him for being gay. And by the events of the mission, now it was time to do things wrong for once. Abul was motivated by revenge, and the Templars offered him a new world order where he would not be judged for his sexual orientation, which is why he followed the cause. I imagine why he joined the Templars instead of the Assassins is because he felt the people didn't deserve free will, as they saw him as an abomination, and that controlling them and dictating how they think would be more in line with expressing himself the way he wanted to. He was attracted to men, and he didn't want to be judged. But unfortunately, that's not how the world works. While discrimination for one's sexuality is not right, dominating over them and forcing them to accept it is not the right solution either. Education is better than indoctrination, but Abul likely felt that it would take far too long for progress to be made, and thus, he became a natural ally of the Templars. In my opinion, Abul may be perceived as somewhat tragic, and the Templars, despite not being bigots, may have exploited that. Still, Abul believed in establishing a new world order, but his primary motivation was to not be seen as a freak of nature. And you could say that's what he cared about the most, and at the end of the day, forgot other people's struggles in life. In his position, being gay was the least of his problems, because he was still incredibly wealthy. William of Montferrat is the fifth man to be slain by Altair's blade, and his assassination was actually heavily based on the historical assassination of his son Conrad, who is mentioned during this sequence. William is presented as a ruthless military commander, working behind King Richard the Lionheart's back, and even executed prisoners. William is by all definitions a hard person to work with. He is seen berating his men, and when he's finally put to rest by Altair, he reveals that all of his power plays were not for his son Conrad, whom he openly refers to as an arse who couldn't lead anything, but the Templars. Now William, like everyone else so far, fought and died for the Templar cause, and he, of course, did not go about his goal the right way. William was an authoritarian at its core, and showed mercy to no one. He barely cared about his son, as seen in his final confession, and clearly was only loyal to his cause. It's for this reason that I believe that William was very skewed in his defense that he took food from the people because he wanted to properly ration it, because it just reeks of the Templars' goal of control over others, and William is not someone who can easily be trusted to ration out food properly to the people. Given his treatment of those in his army, I see it far more likely that he would have given the food only to those who were the most loyal. and left everyone else to starve. It should also be noted that out of all the Templars in the game, he did not keep his disdain for Richard the Lionheart secret. He openly executed Muslim prisoners with next to no care of the consequences, and immediately spoke when Richard left. I think this might indicate that even before he joined the Templar Order, he, at the end of the day, never got along with Richard whatsoever, and perhaps saw him as too soft. He hated Richard enough to conspire against him after all, so I think it's likely that his actions against him were not just out of a desire to create the New World Order, but rather out of petty spite for Richard. William, as an authoritarian, was probably happy that Richard held him back as a tyrannical commander, and so he aligned himself with the Templars to get rid of him. His desire to get rid of Richard was purely a personal reason, and as much as he tried defending it by citing a New World Order that would be a place where all may thrive, it's not the true reason. He just hated Richard, and saw the Templars as the best way to get rid of him. It's for this reason that I believe him joining or making an alliance with the Templars was more recent than other targets. William also claimed that Acre belonged to the people, but at the same time ruled over them with an iron fist. He never let the people make their own decisions, and clearly saw them as commodities to serve the New World Order. And that's probably as much as William meant by his words, that the people own Acre, but the Templars control them. So with that being said, that's how William of Montferrat factors into this story. Marge de Dean is perhaps the most evil of the Templars. He did not defend himself with words stating why he believed he was right. Instead, he stated that he killed people because it was fun, because it made him feel like a god, and it was his way of obtaining fame and glory. On top of unfairly punishing innocent people, or merely people Marge de Dean did not like for petty reasons, this character stands out for his unapologetic cruelty, as Altair stabbed him in the neck a second time, having neither justified his actions through words or show remorse for them. Marge de Dean was a greedy, power-hungry tyrant who cheapened his way to the top. As stated before, he slated innocent people to be killed out of sheer sadism, and that's probably the best way to describe Marge de Dean, that he kills for the fun of it. I imagine the man was easily bored by responsible rule of Jerusalem, so he merely resorted to cruelty to spice things up. Marge de Dean had no empathy whatsoever, and clearly only cared about himself, as during his final moments, he gloated about how the people cheered when he was condemning people to death. The fact too, that he knew what he was doing wasn't right, and did it anyways, says a lot about him, as his alliance with the Templar Order was purely a reason to be even crueler than he would be on his own. Sometimes you just don't get a justification. Marge de Dean relished in being cruel, and was psychopathic to its core. And while there are villains who did worse than him, he had nowhere near as much resources as them, but still stood out by his complete lack of empathy. There isn't much to say about him, because he offered no justification, merely admitting that he did everything he did for thrills, for excitement, not caring who he harmed along the way. He didn't care for the New World Order, he was just a sadist, and Altair rightly punished him for his crimes. Sir Brand isn't given enough characterization during his mission, as we see he is mostly driven by fear. While he did block the ports, not allowing people to dock, he did this because he believed in orders he was given. Like most of the other Templars, he believed in the New World, especially after seeing what happened after death. Nothing. Altair did attempt to calm Sir Brand in his final moments, but Sir Brand had nothing to look forward to. He would not die and go to heaven or hell, he would instead get nothingness, realizing through the Peace of Eden that nothing awaited him after death. He knew his death was coming due to the deaths of the other Templars Altair had killed so far, but instead of reflecting on how to be a better man, Sir Brand merely acted out of fear. He was not a strong person. He was likely easily swayed by his superiors in the Templar Order, and ironically he may have lived longer if he had managed to become accustomed to death, as I imagine being shown the truth of what happens after death shapes Sir Brand into a Templar in the first place. Knowing that your consciousness has one chance before being cast away forever terrified Sir Brand, so he likely saw the world in a much more negative lens. There isn't much specific characterization on Sir Brand, but he was paranoid of death, knowing that life is all he had. He likely adopted a nihilist view of the world, and ironically, he ultimately demonstrated that there is a place for religion, as regardless of what the final fate after death is, at least Christians and Muslims will die believing they will go somewhere, and it's better to die happy before nothingness than to be scared and fearful. I can also imagine that Sir Brand was another recent member of the Templar Order, as being shown nothing happens after death likely manipulated him into serving the Templar cause, because he would feel at least that his life had some meaning in the end. Jubayir stands out for not being a politician, but a scholar. But calling him a scholar by definition would be quite wrong, as he was motivated to destroy all the city's texts, and as a fellow scholar tried to point out to him. And of course, Jubayir merely resorted to burning his former friend alongside the books instead of listening to him. Now, Jubayir's defense upon his death does make sense, to an extent. Being a Templar and thereby an atheist, was not corrupted by the drawbacks of religion, but he, in turn, did not have a clear right from wrong. Jubayir likely meant his words from freeing people from their ignorance, but destroying literature was not the way to go about this. Because at the end of the day, he was destroying books indiscriminately without reading every book and checking to see if they had a corrupting influence or they were flawed in their philosophy. He burned as much as he could, and that goes against his own philosophy. The idea of doing your own research, as the solution to burn down thousands of years of writings would ultimately damn the people to start anew, and may actually hamper progress rather than accelerate it. Like it or not, previous literature inspiring new literature and both building off of each other is a much better way to advance the world than to just destroy the past. It may not be an easy or simple solution, but being a Templar and knowing about the pieces of Eden, Jubayir should have had the foresight to see that destroying irreplaceable lore was not the way to go. Jubayir defended his book burnings by stating that it's what led to the Third Crusade in the first place, but this is rendered hollow by the fact that the war was egged on by the Templars. While they planned to recreate the world with the Apple of Eden, it was a plan that ultimately failed, as the assassins got the treasure first, and as such the war continued, with no backup plan whatsoever, a flawed plan and terrible execution. Ultimately, Jubayir may be the most noble in goal, but his resort to violence, killing a fellow scholar who disagreed with him, made him a hypocrite when he claimed to Altair that wasn't he just like those books, a source of knowledge of which he disagrees with? Perhaps if he had not killed that scholar, who called him friend even, he wouldn't have qualified. Robert the Sub was the Grand Master of the Templar Order, and thus indirectly responsible for the other crimes of the other high-ranking Templars mentioned already. Resourceful and clever, Robert demonstrated that he was able to adapt to the assassins thwarting his plans. While it's revealed that Altair's mentor Al-Mualim, who we'll get to, was too a Templar, and conspired with Robert and the 8 other men, he stole the apple, intending to have the piece of Eden for himself. Robert always had a plan to counteract this betrayal. After losing the piece of Eden, he led a siege on Masyaf to get it back. Of course, this didn't succeed, and he and his forces had to retreat. And during all this, I imagine he was scheming on how to get the apple back. That's where he decided to turn his allies' failures and death into a victory, by uniting Richard the Lionheart and Salahadin into forging an alliance and destroying the assassins in Masyaf. A plan that Altair himself admitted was crazy, but plausible enough to work. Robert, like most of the other Templars, resented the establishment, and intended to create a new world order. And as the Grand Master, I imagine he was devoted to his plan more than anyone. He recruited men on both sides and was not discriminatory, as he, after all, had an openly gay man join his ranks. And as we saw before his death, a young woman named Maria who desired to be a knight, but couldn't because of extreme gender bias of the time. As inclusive as Robert was, this was ultimately to control the central aspects of the Third Crusade, and clearly held little care for his allies as people. Still, it was his greatest strength because he managed to gain allies through a common cause. But as seen with Majd-ad-Din, Robert, despite not discriminating, also did not consider who he gave high places in the regime, as all of his allies were at the very least extremists. And Majd-ad-Din in particular didn't care about the Templar cause, and was a potential liability. Robert may have been a little too unbiased, as he allowed tyrants to join his ranks, and it's what led to his downfall. Because as mentioned previously, Al-Mualim betrayed him and the 8 other men, and sent Altair to kill all of them, so that he could have the Apple of Eden for himself. Robert may have been too lenient for his own good as a matter of fact, and he didn't learn in the end, because in his final moments, he berates Altair, stating that all this time, he kept him safe from harm, but now that he's taken his life, Altair in the process ended his own. Al-Mualim absolutely gets the most screen time, and being a twist villain, his villainy is only directly displayed at the end. And while there is a limited time to see him as a villain, there is a lot we can gather from his earlier appearances. Al-Mualim was the mentor of the Assassin's Creed in the Holy Land, who secretly held Templar philosophy. I think perhaps in the beginning, he may have followed the tenets of the Creed to the letter, but becoming leader corrupted him into a tyrant. He is ultimately shown to be a hypocrite post-reveal, and gets Altair to do dirty work for him. He used his poor performance as an assassin as an excuse to get him to kill the 9 other Templars. But I have a suspicion that it was actually because he failed to get him the Piece of Eden, and so he wanted to punish him, and eliminate his competition at the same time. He also promoted Malik at the same time for retrieving the Piece of Eden, but at the same time had him moved to Jerusalem. Likely because as someone as loyal as him to the Creed, he couldn't risk him finding out the truth about him. Al-Mualim was far more successful than Robert de Saab at manipulation. He wanted the same thing as the Templars, but resorted to even more selfish means in the process, betraying both the Assassin Brotherhood and the Templar Order. The insignia of the Templars did not matter to him. Only the acquisition of peace the way he saw to achieve it. Control. Unfortunately for him, his one mistake was teaching the tenets of the Creed to Altair in the first place. And even after learning that Al-Mualim was a traitor to the Creed, Altair and by extension Malik continued to obey the tenets, and topped with Altair's willpower and skill, he defeated Al-Mualim despite his manipulations. Altair may have been manipulated by Al-Mualim, but it is ultimately worth noting that as the one hunting down the 9 Templars, he was skilled at combat and stealth, while Al-Mualim was an aging man who may have possessed a mind weapon, but Altair was not mentally affected by it, and his arrogance at toying with Altair instead of just killing him cost his goal, although in the end, he did accept his defeat, telling Altair to claim his newfound pride. Perhaps Al-Mualim believed that there would be another to take his place, but regardless, Al-Mualim did have some honor in the end. He at the end of the day desired peace, and while he resorted to control and enslavement to do so, he was capable of accepting his fate, and as I said, he may have believed in the Creed once, but was corrupted by the top position, and became an authoritarian rather than a wise mentor, as he pretended to be for everyone. So that's my assessment of the targets from the original Assassin's Creed. One thing is consistent throughout all these targets. They all desired power and control, and were willing to do questionable things to achieve that goal. All of them, save for Majd-ad-Din, may have meant well, but were wrong in how they went about it, and ultimately, they can all be classified as evil. Thank you for listening to this episode of Analyzing Evil. What do you think of the targets? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?